Hey Unwrappers, just before we begin this week's show, I wanted to let you know about the daily digital digests, also from the week. With everything you need to know in one balanced read, the week's daily digital digests give you space to reflect on the news, away from the noise. You can try 6 weeks for free in our winter sale and then save an extra 30% on an annual digital or print and digital subscription. Just enter the offer code WINTER at theweek.com/offer to start your free trial today. That's theweek.com/offer and the offer code WINTER. And now on with the show. It's the week ending Friday the 31st of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a passenger plane colliding with a military helicopter in Washington, D.C., tech stocks stabilising after Chinese AI app DeepSeek wiped billions from US firms, and Rachel Reeves announcing the government support for a third runway at Heathrow. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Rebekah Evans from Down Under. It's Arion McNicoll from History Podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors. And we welcome back BBC sports journalist Emma Smith. And as I mentioned in the intro there, this has been DeepSeek's week, the number one app in the US. So be honest with me now, don't overthink it. Rebekah, what is your number one app? If I was to look at your phone, what do you use the most?
Probably WhatsApp, to be honest. It's just very convenient and easy to use, really. So.
Emma?
Spotify, for the very many podcasts I listen to, including this one.
Arion?
Rapidly becoming ChatGPT, so let's see if DeepSeek unseats that particular number one.
I haven't used it in app form. What do you, when it's just there on your phone, what's the most handy use of ChatGPT on the go?
Well, you can actually chat with it now, and they've got various kinds of personalities. Yeah, I've got no one to speak to when I'm not podcasting.
All right. Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, sunny multicultural Australia took a dark turn.
This is the discovery of a potential mass casualty event. There's only one way of calling it out, and that is terrorism. That's what we're very worried about. This would strike terror into the community, particularly the Jewish community.
Chris Minns, Premier of New South Wales, speaking at a press conference on Wednesday. And Arion, this is a big story in Sydney, where you are, but the rest of us may well have missed it. So what's happened this week?
Yeah, so this week, Australian police said that they found a caravan in northwest Sydney that was packed with explosives and also accompanied with anti-Semitic material, including a list of Jewish areas across Sydney that looked like they were being considered as sites for a possible bomb attack. And the caravan was actually found by police last week, but it only became public this week after it was leaked to the media. And police were initially very defensive, but also quick to say that the owner of the caravan is in custody, though on unrelated matters apparently. But this pretty troubling discovery comes following a spate of anti-Semitic incidents in Australia's two biggest cities of Sydney and Melbourne, including arson attacks on synagogues and swastikas scrawled on buildings and cars. And it seemed significant, particularly as the world paused to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz.
Is it something you're aware of, walking around Sydney?
No, I mean, in a day-to-day way, not particularly, other than the fact that it's in the news in a big, serious way because of all of this stuff that's going down.
So is that, I suppose the thing is, we've seen a build-up of anti-Semitism in Australia, as you've outlined. Then you get a dramatic example like this. Is the response from people there shock? Or is it like, oh, well, you could see that we were leading up to something like this?
I think that's a combination of both. I mean, I think that there's no surprise about the impact of the 7th October attack by Hamas on Israel and Israel's subsequent war in Gaza and the way that that has had real reverberations around the whole world. But I think that there is something a bit surprising about a country that is regarded as being kind of progressive and multicultural and accepting of different communities, and after all, a country that has the largest number of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. So, this is a country that really has embraced its Jewish community historically. And so I think that it does feel like a big shift in that sense.
Yeah, why do you think we've seen that shift, Rebekah? What do you think is leading to this rise in anti-Semitism in Australia specifically, as opposed to the rest of the world, where unfortunately we've also seen a rise?
Yeah, as you say, I don't think there's much of Australia bucking any particular global trend. You know, we're seeing, unfortunately, a rise of anti-Semitism across the world. But perhaps, you know, Australia could be seen as a potential hot point for these types of hate crimes, just because of growing polarization in society. Politics is becoming more and more fraught with people going to the left and extreme left and right wing. There's also the fact that Australia has had fewer large-scale kind of extremist incidents in recent years. So potentially there could be kind of a feeling of a perceived lack of vigilance there, which makes Australia potentially easier to target. Obviously, the Israel-Gaza conflict, obviously support for Palestine doesn't automatically equal anti-Semitism, but I think there are still some extremists who are using that movement to justify the anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks.
And Emma, it's social media that's pumping a lot of that ideology into people's phones, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a study recently which came up with all sorts of slightly startling stats about public awareness of the Holocaust and other, you know, anti-Semitic events and crimes. And, for example, 23% of UK adults have encountered Holocaust denial online. For those aged 18 to 29, 42% of them came across it on TikTok. And a third of young adults in the UK are unable to name Auschwitz or any of the other concentration camps. So I think that there's definitely a knowledge gap emerging when it comes to these kind of things, and into that ignorance, hate can flourish. I think it's particularly an issue now because we're going into the first generation of people who don't have any sort of familial links to, you know, World War II and stuff like that. Like, for example, my grandparents were young children during World War II. So kids growing up now will have no sort of like family connections to, you know, what happened. So that is basically becoming ancient history and sort of like something that's been completely lost to the past. And that ignorance, whether willing or unwilling, it can lead to hate, which can lead to stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on Monday, Arion. I suppose an event like that actually does get, you know, the Holocaust back in the news and gets people talking about it again and remembering or learning for the first time, as Emma was alluding to. But yeah, aside from the 100th anniversary of that event in 20 years' time, at which point everyone who was there will probably be dead, it's hard to see how you continue to keep that conversation going. It's inevitable. That's how history works. It does recede into the past.
I think that's right. And it was notable that 10 years ago at the very same event at Auschwitz, there were 300 survivors who turned up to mark the occasion. And this week there were only 50. And I think that is a sign of the fact that there is this very rapid decline of the number of people who actually lived through the thing that is being spoken about. And I think that is reflected by some of those statistics that Emma was talking about. One of the other ones that came out of that same study that really caught my eye was that the pure number of young adults aged 18 to 29 who hadn't heard of the Holocaust itself. In France, it was 46% of people. In Germany, 12%. I was just staggered by the idea that in Germany it would be possible that 1 in every 10 people, or even more than that, haven't actually heard of the Holocaust itself. So, you know, I think that there is a lot of knowledge that's being lost, and it is incumbent upon not only the survivors, but people who are the children of the survivors and even people unconnected with it, to ensure that that whole pledge of never again is able to continue through the fact that people know what it is that they're trying to prevent in the first place.
But there's very little evidence, Rebekah, that that's happening. It's easy, isn't it, to say, oh, never again, and to say the right things and give the right messages for politicians. But, you know, we have Elon Musk doing a Nazi salute last week. We have his social network amplifying disinformation deliberately. So who's telling him not to? Like, you know, if the problem is, as Emma suggests, social media, politicians can say one thing and journalists can say one thing, but that's not what people are receiving. And it doesn't appear they're changing in any way to stop the amplification of that message.
Yeah, it's definitely very concerning seeing these things kind of escalate once again, particularly because obviously Holocaust survivors have told us that it's so important that we never forget what happened in the past so that we can avoid history repeating itself. But I think there's kind of a bystander effect which happened in the first place. You know, people see it as potentially not their problem or not their fight to get into, and that's where things can escalate and snowball very, very quickly into a situation that none of us really expected. We've seen it before, so we all have to play our part to make sure that's something that never occurs again.
I do wonder as well, Emma, and maybe this is because I'm Jewish, I think of, because Jews being a minority, I think of part of the issue here being that most people don't know a Jew or don't know that they know a Jew, even if they do know a Jew. And so, as Rebekah correctly said earlier, you know, support for Palestine doesn't mean that you're anti-Semitic. Equally, you know, even if you oppose Israel and thought it was right for people to protest Israel, not in this violent way, but to protest, you know, being Jewish doesn't mean you support Israel. And even if you do support Israel, it doesn't mean that you support the current government or the techniques of the war against Hamas. And maybe that gets lost because, you know, despite what everyone says about Jews holding powerful positions in the media, you know, there aren't that many Jewish spokespeople around.
Yes, I think basically these anti-Semitic sort of conspiracy theories, which are older than any of us, and they've been allowed to flourish more than ever because of the freedom of speech that social media allows. And in the end, it's important to sort of combat that with solid historical information, facts. And I mean, you look in Australia where the Albanese government have dedicated more than $4 million for the National Holocaust Education Centre in Canberra. It's important that, you know, solid action like that is taken so that, again, sort of like misinformation and sort of ill-meaning debate can be countered.
This is a breaking news story as we record, Arion, so obviously I haven't asked you too much about this particular incident and what might happen next because it could be out of date by the time people are listening, but it does look like possibly there are bad actors funding events like this in Australia at the moment. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really curious aspect of the small amount of information that the Australian Federal Police were willing to share, that they said foreign actors could be behind some of the attacks that are going on, and it could potentially be people who are being paid to commit crimes on behalf of whoever these foreign actors are. And police lines of inquiry also included the possibility that young people in Australia aren't being paid per se, but are also being radicalised online to commit these anti-Semitic attacks. That's also a possibility. But the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Patterson, kind of responded to the fact that the Prime Minister had come out and said that this same thing, that foreign actors may have been behind it. And he said that it was a really gravely serious claim. He said this either means, if true, that a transnational terrorist organisation is sponsoring attacks in Australia, or potentially that a foreign government is engaging in state-sponsored terror targeting of the Jewish community. And both of those seem pretty upsetting possibilities if they are true. But I think, you know, as you say, this is something that continues to unfold and we don't have all the information. And I think it is important, just as a final thought, to consider the fact that even though there is this rising number of attacks, they're still very small. And I read this piece of commentary from a guy called Andrew Marcus, who's a professor at Monash University in Melbourne. And he said that this is still a small segment, a minute segment, he said, that's causing fear and anxiety in headlines. And I think that's really important to consider, that we're not necessarily talking about a wide-scale radicalization. It is true that intolerance towards Jewish people is going up, but it's minor as compared to something like the possibility that someone was about to blow up a caravan in a part of Sydney that was popular with Jewish people. So
yeah, but by the same token, I mean, maybe we've fallen down this trap as well because we instantly start talking about social media and misinformation. You're right. The actual reality of exploding things and killing people, that's the thing that the police have to deal with first, isn't it? That's the thing the government have to deal with first. You know, funding a Holocaust centre is something that might stop future radicalism. Are you confident that they are on top of the terrorism beat?
Not necessarily. And they haven't actually yet called it terrorism. That's been kind of a space that has been occupied by politicians who, some of whom seem to be keen to get their names involved in what is a big story. But also, you don't have to look too far to think that this could have been a terrorist incident potentially. But I think we do need to wait for a bit more information before we leap to terrorism specifically.
And Rebekah, for the Jewish community in Australia, how are they reacting to this seeming rising trend for anti-Semitic attacks, whether they're carried out eventually or scuppered?
Yes, well, as you identify, it's not just this event with the caravan. You know, we've seen other anti-Semitic acts taking place. But I think what's really positive is that interfaith communities are joining together in Australia to condemn this violence openly and to urge solidarity between them. We've seen kind of small-scale events taking place where the whole community is standing openly with Jewish Australians, which is really positive. And from a grassroots level, you know, community leaders calling for harsher penalties for anti-Semitic crimes. So I think seeing the support that Jewish Australians have on the ground is really important, and hopefully that will reflect in the actions that politicians take next.
Okay. Up next, why what's happening in Africa underground has an impact on what's in your pocket now. That's after this. Okay, Rebekah, you're up next. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How much blood is in your phone?
No, one people, one nation. Together we can fight the wars in the world. Stop exploitation, cause every day my people die. No con, no phone. Yeah, no con, no phone. On fait pas soldat. Nazamwan and Boga. You're free, come free Sudan. You're free, come free Sudan.
Free Congo, free Sudan. Amazing bit of rap in there from a young boy on the streets in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's really amazing when you see the footage because he's clearly about 13 years old. Shared by Pappy Orion on TikTok earlier this month. Rebekah, what's the story? What's been happening this week in the DRC?
Well, the first thing many of us will have done this morning is pick up our phones. But what you might not have realised is that in doing so, you might be indirectly contributing to a conflict that has come to a head this week, thousands of miles away in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The fight for the country that is rich in minerals that make their way into our tech has reached boiling point this week with the invasion of rebel groups into certain cities. So what's going on, and are we all complicit?
Okay, good questions. What is going on? Let's save are we all complicit? There are mines, aren't they, for important minerals in the DRC, and that's been an area of fighting for some time. What's new?
Well, exactly. I mean, the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo is quite complex and difficult to kind of get into. But essentially, the primary culprit of this ongoing conflict is the rich natural resources that are found within that particular country. The DRC contains an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral resources. And essentially what's going on is that armed groups are fighting in the eastern region of the country over power, land and resources. They want to be able to control the areas where the minerals are and make profit from that. So this has culminated this week in a particularly influential armed group called M23, who have now taken control of Goma, which is a key city in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Okay, so minerals then. Emma, what minerals and how do we use them in our technology products?
Yes, so they're not minerals that one might sort of immediately know, things like coltan, wolfram, cassiterite, stuff that's really not very familiar to layperson off the bat, but they're important minerals in some of our most used items in everyday life. They're crucial in the production of batteries for technology such as phones, laptops, tablets, stuff like that. So they are incredibly valuable in the modern world, despite the fact that their names might not be quite so familiar.
And what about M23 as a group, Arion? Can you give us an overview of who they are, who these people are, who now may have control of that supply chain?
Yeah, so the roots of the M23 movement in the DRC are deeply embedded in the region's colonial history and also those really long-standing ethnic tensions between the Tutsi and Hutu populations. And that's because during Belgian colonial rule in the early to mid-20th century, I'm sorry, I'm going a bit further back than you might have anticipated with the question you asked. But anyway, around that time, Tutsis were favoured over Hutus by the Belgians, and that created this huge division that not only deepened after Rwanda gained independence in 1962, but even after that time, tensions just continued to build. And in 1994, the Rwandan genocide saw Hutu extremists massacre an estimated 800,000 Tutsis. And the resulting instability then sucked in neighbouring countries to devastating effect, notoriously in the 1990s, when two huge conflicts that have since been dubbed Africa's World Wars resulted in the deaths of millions of people. And in the years since, Rwanda has continued to support various rebel groups in the DRC's eastern regions, often fairly plainly to secure mineral resources, which brings us to M23, which was your question after all. So the M23 movement was named after a March 23, 2009 peace agreement, which was intended to integrate Tutsis into the Congolese army's ranks. But many of those soldiers ultimately mutinied, accusing the DRC government of failing to uphold the terms of that agreement, and then they went rogue. And today, M23 continues to operate in the east of the DRC, fueled by both those ethnic rivalries and, very obviously, by Rwanda as well, which is using M23 to covertly gain access to the region's mineral wealth. So that's kind of the story that's underpinning the whole business of this latest flare-up of violence.
Okay, good potted history. I mean, we heard the rap there, Rebekah, that you played for us, and the boy kind of pleading for peace in his lyrics. What do the people of the DRC want? Because presumably there is some support for some of these groups. Is it divided, or is there a clear democratic alternative?
It's hard to say, really, because the conflict has been going on for so long that essentially most of the population just want peace. I mean, we're looking at massive displacement. As of early 2024, it's estimated that some 7.1 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Civilians are undoubtedly bearing the brunt of this conflict, whether it's facing threats of murder, sexual violence, human rights abuses. As we heard there with the boy who was rapping, a lot of children are also involved in this. They are the miners themselves, going down into these very dangerous environments to mine these minerals, but not getting any health and safety, also getting very little pay, sometimes just pennies a day, for the really dangerous work that they're doing. So there's a lot of conflict, obviously, and I think that the main objective of the people of Congo is just for peace.
And that's part of the reason that they have the name blood minerals, these minerals like blood diamonds. Just talk us through exactly what that means.
Well, essentially what is happening is that there is a booming informal mining sector, which is known as artisanal mining, that is happening within the DRC.
See, artisanal mining sounds nice, doesn't it? It sounds bespoke.
It does, but it's actually very, very awful. So essentially, artisanal mining is what we consider to be freelance work.
Right. Turn up with a shovel, basically, and get yourself some minerals.
Exactly, yeah. Very hazardous techniques, really kind of basic tools, and as I mentioned, extremely low pay. But this is one of the few sources of income that is available to some of the world's most poorest people. It's a good way for these mining companies to kind of boost production and obviously get more profit by doing so. But the effects on those who are mining are obviously devastating.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the pictures, Emma, online, when this is reported in the British media, you know, there are a few photos of people in these artisanal mines. And yeah, the conditions are worse than you'd expect in a mine in Wales or Yorkshire 100 years ago. You know, there is no equipment for safety. There are no helmets. They are literally with their bare hands going down ladders into dangerous places where they could be buried alive.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate just how dangerous some of this stuff is. And I mean, it really just sort of throws into sharp focus, you know, the tech companies which profit from these minerals being mined to make batteries for their products. They will talk about wanting to have, ethical practices, be environmentally conscious, but the reality is these often very young children really being sent into incredibly dangerous scenarios. And I mean, the Ministry of Mining in the DRC recommends that mines should dig no deeper than 30 meters below the surface, but reports say that they can sometimes go as deep as 200 meters in order to get the resources. It's incredibly dangerous, and it's something that's having an impact on all our lives, because it's to supply the demand that we have for tech products.
Yeah, so let's talk about that then, Arion, because these are the biggest, wealthiest companies in the world that we're talking about here. This isn't some mum and pop company that makes some business-to-business, pocket calculator, and they wouldn't be able to trace every element from the companies they buy from. We're talking about Apple, Microsoft, Tesla. Why can't they trace what they're buying? Why can't they pour some of their profits into making sure they're not exploiting children?
Well, they claim that they can, and they publish reports which indicate that they do. And I think that there is a certain amount of truth to what they publish, but I think that there's many, many places along the line where information can be fabricated and become confused, and actually it's not always in everyone's interests to know exactly where all of the minerals that go into our technology come from. And tech companies do now face this real growing scrutiny over their supply chains, and particularly the demand for rare earth minerals that is fueling all of this conflict after all. And the DRC itself has actually sued Apple's subsidiaries in Brussels and Paris, basically alleging that its latest iPhones contain minerals that were literally smuggled from within the conflict zones within the DRC. And if those cases proceed, there is going to be a real question of what's called source separation, because one of the things that Rwanda, for example, claims is that it mines its own minerals. And so, it's got plenty of minerals bound up in the stuff that it's exporting. But the question is, how much of that output is legally sourced from its own mines rather than smuggled in from conflict zones in the DRC? And I think that is going to be a thing that comes out only if these court cases proceed.
I mean, what does responsible mineral mining look like? Rebekah, is there an example? Or does it all come from within the conflict zones ultimately?
In the south of the DRC, there's cobalt mining, cobalt is not considered to be a blood mineral, because for the most part they believe that it's ethically sourced, but in the same breath there's a lot of child labor that goes into that kind of thing. So I don't think there's necessarily any particular example of totally ethical sourcing of anything when it comes to these minerals. It's just about companies doing the best that they can to have the most ethical practices. But as we can see through the conflicts that are happening within this region, it's all but impossible, really.
Do you have sympathy then, Emma, with the tech companies who will say that it's impossible? Like, we'll do our best and we will produce ethical reports, but actually there's only so much we can do because it isn't possible to track everything and where it's come from.
As a general rule, I don't think it's a good idea to have sympathy with giant tech companies at all.
You do have the worst internet out of everybody here.
Yes. I mean, there is an issue in that there is so much of this material that comes from the DRC, which is a country which has been absolutely ripped apart by, civil war, famine, as Arion mentioned. I mean, there's an estimated up to $24 trillion worth of untapped minerals in the DRC, which is a country which has, by recent Save the Children estimates, 25 million people in food poverty, outbreaks of things like monkeypox. It's one of those things that this is a country that is so important to the world's economy, but is in such a state. But of course, it's in such a state partly because of, Western colonialism. Yes, there is sort of obviously an element to which these companies have to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo and all the issues that exist there. But given the power and influence a lot of these and money that a lot of these companies have, you feel that they could be doing a lot more to try and help.
Is there a way it could become a positive, though, Arion? I mean, if you think about, the California gold rush or the Gulf states and oil, I mean, actually, is there a future for this region of Africa that actually reaps the rewards of being the world's centre for these minerals that we all depend on?
Possibly, but I think first you would have to really get the conflicts in the east of the DRC under control. The Economist had this really interesting feature this week, which was explaining what's going on via the analogy of what went on in Donbass in 2014 when Vladimir Putin seized a chunk of eastern Ukraine while pretending not to, and then used local separatist forces that Russia, after all, had armed and controlled as a cover, and they were claiming that they were defending ethnic Russians from persecution by Ukrainian bigots or whatever. And Paul Kagame of Rwanda is adopting really, really similar tactics in eastern Congo, with the M23 rebels being armed and supported and directed directly by his regime. And they claim too that they're protecting Congolese Tutsis from supposed persecution, but actually what they're doing is they're seizing territory. This is undeclared war that they're waging, basically. And actually some Western diplomats are afraid that Kagame's ambitions may extend beyond Goma, and possibly that he wants to overthrow the Congolese government itself. And that's not only illegal, but also, as The Economist was pointing out, it signals this really troubling erosion of the international order and a sign that the global taboo where you can't just take other people's territory is disintegrating. So I think, first of all, Kagame has to be got under control. The business of M23 running rampant across the whole east of the DRC needs to be reined in. And then maybe you can decide how to divvy up the spoils in a way that's fair to the people who are sitting on that land.
In the meantime, though, Rebekah, what can we, as citizens, as consumers, what can we do about this?
It's almost inevitable that we are kind of complicit in some way, right? I mean, these are huge multinational tech corporations. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to buy a product that is not Apple or Samsung or one of these giant companies just for ease of use. But I suppose the only thing that we can do really is to conduct our own research. It is obviously a labour-intensive process that we could avoid. But if we're concerned about what's going on in the DRC, as all global citizens should be, it's about just taking the time to look at and investigate what's going on globally and kind of make our decisions from there. At the moment, it seems like we will never be able to completely divest from what's going on in that particular region, but hopefully there's a path that can be charted forwards in the future that we can all be on board with.
Yeah, well, just don't upgrade your phone so often. I know I'm about to link into some adverts, but I mean, seriously, stop buying things you don't need. Up next, breathe in, breathe out, get banned. The chain is about to come off, a controversial tactic in professional cycling. That's after this. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the controversial practice of carbon monoxide rebreathing may take its final breath.
My opinion on this hasn't changed. For as long as we're talking about the sport that we're talking about and the history that the sport has and the individuals who are still involved in the sport, then the ease and the temptation of which you could switch from measuring to performance enhancing is all too simple at the moment.
Amateur cyclist Ronan McLaughlin on cycling channel The Escape Collective. Incidentally, Ronan holds the fastest ever time for Everesting, which is when you climb a hill again and again until you get to the height of Everest. Anyway, Emma, what was he talking about there?
So Ronan McLaughlin, as well as being an amateur cyclist, he's also a journalist for the Escape Collective. And last year at the Tour de France, did a exclusive story about carbon monoxide rebreathing, which is a technique used by has been used in endurance sports for quite a long time, which is basically athletes taking small amounts of carbon monoxide to help emulate the conditions in which air is hard to breathe, such as at high altitude, which obviously is a factor in cycling events, and also can be used to more easily monitor hemoglobin in the bloodstream, allow for these cycling teams to monitor the health and blood flow of their athletes. But this week, potentially by the time that you listen to this podcast, but currently as we record it, the World Cycling's governing body, the UCI, are expected to vote for a ban on carbon monoxide rebreathing equipment being used in the sport.
Okay. I mean, just to go back to basics for a second, because I think for a lot of us, the words carbon monoxide rebreathing are particularly ominous. I thought carbon monoxide was poisonous. Like, that's the thing you're absolutely supposed to never breathe, isn't it?
Yes. And I mean, I hadn't heard of this actually until this week, and there was a piece, explained piece on the BBC Sport website by my colleague Matt Warwick, which really did a good job of sort of laying out exactly what this is. Yes, carbon monoxide is incredibly dangerous, but under very controlled circumstances and with specialist equipment, it can be used to help monitor things in endurance athletes, things like hemoglobin levels, and can also be used to help with, like I say, with training for athletes who are going to be, competing in difficult conditions, such as at high altitude, cycling for huge lengths of time. But obviously it is dangerous, and there is a concern that it is being pushed to dangerous lengths by certain teams, which is why the UCI are being encouraged and quite possibly will move to ban it.
Arion, are the UCI being clear on exactly what it is they're planning on banning? Because if it's always been part of the training regime, then it might be tricky to suddenly say you can't do that when you've been doing it for decades.
Yeah, I think that's not clear, and one of the companies that makes these carbon monoxide rebreathing machines, Datalo Health told Cycling News that really there needs to be much more clarity about what's being called to be banned. And the CEO of Datalo Health, Carsten Lundby, who's also a professor at the University of Southern Denmark, said that while he agrees that there should be advice against people breathing in carbon monoxide, he said that basically, the use of carbon monoxide as a medical diagnostic tool is very different, and, it shouldn't be banned because there's a distinction between those two uses. And the truth is that, lots of cycling teams have been recalcitrant about offering up information about how they use carbon monoxide rebreathing to get any sort of effect or to gather information, which tends to be what at least they would say if they even confess to it. But the question of whether more transparency would help, again, going to the Datalo CEO, he said that basically because there's so few devices in the world, they can see how they're being used in real time. So any malpractice would be very, very clear to see. And so in his opinion, the use of these devices is all above board. So I think that a certain amount of clarity on what is being called for, given that, carbon monoxide exists in the air in any case, is certainly something that would provide a bit of clarity. But I think that in general, there's not even consensus that using carbon monoxide rebreathing will have massively positive effects like altitude training because there's just so little information.
All right. As you say, I guess we do all breathe carbon monoxide a bit, but in terms of how this actually impacts us all, Rebekah, perhaps really the issue here is that this is yet another story affecting the world of cycling. Why is it that cycling, perhaps more than other sports, always seems to attract these kinds of controversies?
Yeah, it's just, I don't know a lot about cycling, if I'm being totally honest, but anytime I hear something about cycling, it's always something controversial, particularly after the whole Lance Armstrong saga that was so well played out within the media. You'd think that this sport would want to kind of clean up its act and make sure that there is absolutely no room for misinterpretation whatsoever. They don't seem to be doing that, and I can't work out why. If we cast our minds back to Lance Armstrong, they said that he ran the most sophisticated, professional and successful doping program that sport has ever seen. That is such a black mark to have upon the sport of cycling. Okay, maybe carbon monoxide rebreathing is above board, or so they say, but it's the grey areas, it's the room for misinterpretation that I would hope that they would want to clear up to make sure that cycling can be enjoyed as a sport where we don't believe that everyone is doping or taking blood transfusions or injecting stuff into themselves to make sure that they get a fraction of a second faster than their competitors. It just seems all a bit murky and not worthwhile at all if we want cycling to be followed in a kind of honest and open way.
I think it's interesting that you make that point, Rebekah, because I think that that's kind of what the UCI are doing. I think that's why they're trying to be active in banning carbon monoxide rebreathing, which is one of those grey areas that, you know, some teams obviously use and it's perfectly above board and others are pushing it a bit far. But I think that the UCI really are moving to sort of like to try and get rid of this because they are so hyper aware of how the sport is perceived by people.
So are they overcompensating actually because of Lance Armstrong?
I think that there's a potential that is what's happening, particularly when it comes to doping and particularly when it comes to blood doping. Cycling has such a poor reputation and such a a touchy reputation. I mean, Rebekah is right that basically the Lance Armstrong case is the most famous sports cheating case of all time, and I think that's partly why the ban looks like it's going to come in, because the UCI are so hyper aware and so sort of desperate to clean up their acts that they are willing to push this through, despite it being a debated topic.
But actually, Arion, if it was all declared, I mean, I understand if it's not declared, then you don't know who's taken what. But if it's all declared and you say, yes, our athletes do carbon monoxide rebreathing on this team, that's one of the things we do. In that sense, is it really any different to them taking vitamins? I mean, elite athletes push their bodies. Where do you draw the line?
I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, I suppose that's what the doping agencies are constantly wrestling with. What is a legitimate use of training apparatus and what gives an athlete an unfair advantage, and what chemicals are they allowed to ingest? Like, can they have a cup of coffee before they have a race, or can they not?
Rebekah, you've just got your pen out. Are you writing down a list of permitted steroids?
Yeah. I'm making a list and checking it twice.
What were you thinking, Rebekah? What was the inspiration that struck you there while Arion was talking?
I just figured, it's easy to lie. You can say that you're doing carbon monoxide rebreathing and it's all above board, but you could be doing something underneath. Like Lance Armstrong said he was taking, or they discovered that he was taking certain drugs, and he said, oh no, actually it's just for saddle sore, don't worry about it, it's fine. And meanwhile, all of this nefarious stuff was going on in the background. What struck me was when Arion was talking is that it's easy to kind of manipulate the information that is being given to these boards. You can say you're being honest and open and transparent, but there could be something going on underneath very easily.
Well, it's also there's the issue, Emma, of whether it actually matters to fans. I mean, that's sort of the most important thing, isn't it? I know for cyclists and athletes, they're worried about the international league tables and their place in history. But for fans, does it matter? In the world of cycling, do fans say, oh, this doesn't count because they took that?
So in the last Tour de France, the top two finishers, the eventual winner Tadej Pogačar, who's now won 3 Tour de France's, and the runner-up Jonas Vingegaard, they're Slovenian and Danish respectively, so I do apologise to the people of those countries.
I think you did a good job.
Thank you. But they both say that they did carbon monoxide rebreathing, and it's one of those things that it was slightly mishandled. For example, Pogačar in an interview initially denied that he did it. His team then clarified that it was, and then he was like, "Oh, I was answering a question in a second language, so I wasn't sure what was being asked." Which it's a plausible excuse. Whereas Vingegaard did it and then is basically spoken out against the more aggressive use of it, pushing the boundaries to try and gain a competitive advantage. And I think that if you've got arguably the 2 best male cyclists in the world right now, who are both admitting to this and embroiled, in slightly controversial things around it, it's another PR nightmare for the sport, and it's another thing which allows sort of fans to be like, see these incredible athletes doing these remarkable things. I mean, winning the Tour de France is.
You've still got to be really good at cycling. Yes,
exactly. To say the least. I mean, it is arguably it's arguably the toughest sport, toughest sporting event to win. And then this great achievement gets left with a question mark next to it.
But then that's the thing about cycling, isn't it, Arion? It's about marginal gains. Like everyone in the final 10 of the Tour de France are all excellent cyclists. So of course, you're coming down to fractions of a second.
Yeah, and I think that sort of highlights the slight absurdity of why we focus so much on doping versus the other kinds of inequalities that we tolerate in sport. We all know that like a nation's Olympic success correlates pretty directly with A, its population, and B, its GDP. Richer nations can afford to have like coaches who can supply the best diets and get the best equipment and all of that. And equally, when you have a country with lots of people, then you can have things like, you can scan for people with unfair sort of bodily advantages, like hypermobile knees and ankles paired with big feet and hands that exist in the case of the British multi-medalist Adam Peaty, and help him go faster. And if you have a bigger population, you're more likely to have people with those sorts of advantages. But I think that the reason that people do focus fairly on doping is because kind of cracking down on steroids is partly concern for the athletes themselves. And I think particularly with something like carbon monoxide, certainly when I started reading it, I was like, there is easily, there's such an obvious way that this can go wrong, where people who suddenly go outside of the realms of the very scrutinized doctor who's helping them do it in a controlled way and do it just a little bit too much. And there they are breathing carbon monoxide. We know that it's poison. And I think that people do have a concern for athletes' health increasingly, and you can see that in the way that people are increasingly attentive to concussion in football or in the NFL, for example. And we know that people like elite athletes often come out with serious body problems. And I think that this is another area that it's worth kind of protecting people. Do we want to push people so far that they actually sustain injuries that are going to haunt them for the rest of their life or even end their lives early? And I think that's part of the issue here.
You know what I think they should do? Big wall of carbon monoxide detectors at the finish line. Beep, beep, beep. Disqualified. Yeah. Solved it.
Or your fridge is open.
Thank you to Arion and to Emma and to Rebekah, and thank you for listening. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.